Several months ago at a lecture, Brian approached me and introduced himself to me and said, I have a book coming out in the summer about Ford's Theater. And I said, oh, wonderful, I'll come in and introduce you. And I'm so happy that I made that commitment because otherwise that I would not have read the book. And the book I just felt is really an impressive production. Brian did, with the help of volunteers from the Ford's Theater Society, he did all the research and writing. It's got, I think, over 200 archival photos that are in the book, along with text. For anybody who has any interest in Lincoln, I promise you that you're going to learn a lot from this, which is really interesting. Brian had one time before that he had experienced writing a book, and that was that he was the co-author of a book called The Class Action Playbook. This is a legal book, a guide to strategic decision making in the pursuit of class actions. He's also an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University and a frequent writer on litigation issues. Um, I, uh, when I finished looking at this book, I thought Brian Anderson is somebody who really should be cloned. I mean, what a labor of love that this has been, and what a labor of love that his work with the Ford's Theater Society has been since 2001. He's been a trustee and counsel for them. He leads tours. He is certainly the Ford Theater Society's greatest booster that I am aware of. And so and also he serves as legal counsel to the District of Columbia Public Charter School Board. So it's a wonderful amount of time that Brian spends pro bono to a lot of just good causes. And I was in awe of that, as well as that I was in awe of the book. Brian graduated from the University of California at Berkeley, magna cum laude. He went on to Stanford Law School, where he was on the law review, and then came to Washington to practice law, and he said it was here that he developed his interest in Abraham Lincoln. He was not a Lincoln scholar when he came to Washington, but I think he qualifies as a Lincoln scholar now. So you'll hear from a good scholar today. Here's Brian.
Thank you, Barbara. What an honor it is to stand in the place where I've watched so many fabulous writers talk about their books, and to be able to talk about my book. As many of you know, we live about a block away from here. We've been members of Politics and Prose for many years. I've come to many of these talks. Politics and Prose promotes itself as a full-service bookstore. And the breadth of that service, at least in our family, is so broad that when my wife was pregnant with two of our children, she stopped working a couple weeks before the due date because she decided it was time to kind of slow down and relax. And she spent her days here at Politics and Prose, hanging out, counting the contractions, calling me every hour from the payphone down by the coffee shop and reporting the news. So. That's right. So you can put that on your website as one of the many services that you provide to members of Politics and Prose. So what I'd like to do today is spend a few minutes talking about how I came to write this book, what the book is, and tell just a few of the many fascinating stories from the 180-year history of the building in which Ford's Theater once sat and happily sits again today. And then I'll be happy to take questions. So how did I come to write this book? Well, I came to Washington, D.C. in 1986 from California as a brand new lawyer. And I was struck by all of the historic buildings here in Washington, and it was partly as a result of walking around all of this history that I only read about in textbooks while in California, because of course California has no history, that I decided to stay here in Washington. So fast forward 8 years, 1994, I attended my first performance at Ford's Theater. I think it was called the Tuna something or other. And I sat in the cheap seats in the back, and with half of my mind I thought about the performance, and with the other half of my mind I thought, man, here I am sitting in one of the most famous or infamous places in the United States. And that's about all I thought of Ford's Theater. You know, one more historic building. And I moved on. Fast forward another 7 years, and through a variety of circumstances, I had found myself a member of the Board of Trustees of the Ford's Theater Society, which is the nonprofit organization founded in 1967 to produce theatrical productions at the Ford's Theater space. And I've been a trustee of Ford's Theater now for 13 years. Survived the transition from the founder of Ford's Theater Society, Frankie Hewitt, to the current management of the theater, and have been involved in a dramatic expansion of the physical space and the programming that Ford's Theater Society offers. So as a trustee of the society, I thought, well, you know, I probably ought to learn a little bit more about this building other than the fact that Lincoln was shot here. And so I read everything I could find about the theater, and I found, much to my surprise, that there was no currently published, up-to-date, comprehensive book about the history of this iconic American building. And I thought, with the knowledge that I was gradually gaining, that I was a pretty good guy to write this book. As Barbara mentioned, I had written a book about class actions. The sticker price on the book, I think, was about $150, and it was aimed at a very narrow audience. Suffice it to say that I did no talks at Politics and Prose about the class action playbook. But I thought I had it in me to write another book about a more public interested topic. It so happened that the staff, the education staff at Ford's Theater Society, thought that that would be a good idea as well. Part of their mission is to use the theater to teach people about the history of the theater, about the events that surround the theater, and more broadly about Abraham Lincoln and his legacy. So they were all for having a book be written. And so we decided to work together and create this book. So over the course of about a year and a half, as Barbara said, I went through research libraries, I went through file cabinets, I found old photographs of the building at every stage of its development, photographs of the people who have been instrumental in the history of the building, blueprints, historical letters, just all kinds of fascinating things that relate to the 180-year history of the Ford's Theater building. And we put the book together, and it came out in April, and it's been doing quite well. So what is the book? Well, the book is one of, I guess, about 8,000 books that the Arcadia Publishing Company puts out. Arcadia specializes in producing books about the history of small towns and cities around America, about buildings, about aspects of those cities, and they consist generally of historical photographs with text that describe the significance of those photographs. And the nice thing about this book is that it, particularly for the 650,000 people who come to Ford's Theater every year because of the assassination, for $22, they can buy this book, they can stick it on their backpack, they can read it in the bus on the way home, and it's a terrific supplement to their tour. So it has been doing quite well. So the images and the text not only trace the entire history of the building, but it does so in the context of the history of the District of Columbia, which is fascinating in its own right and has had its ups and downs, just as the theater has had its ups and downs, as well as the involving debate in the United States about, what do you do with the site of a national tragedy? One of the hallmark things about this building is that it was the first site of a major American tragedy, the first presidential assassination, and given the scope of the conspiracy, you can make the case that it was the first terrorist attack on the government of the United States. And a tremendous debate arose from the first days after the assassination, which continues to this day. What is the right and proper thing to do with Ford's Theater? And it repeats itself every time we have a presidential assassination, a terrorist attack, a natural disaster, a mass shooting. Think about it. All of the things that have happened in the last 10 years, and we always have this debate. Do we leave the building in place? Do we tear it down? Do we build a memorial? What kind of memorial? What do we do? So that's one of the themes running through this book. And the other theme running through this book is that contrary to what I and most people think about the first time they think of Ford's Theater, there is far more of historical significance in the 180-year history of this building than just either the one night for which it's known, or even the 3 years when it was a Civil War era theater in downtown Washington, D.C. So that's what the book is about. And there are many stories in this book about the history of the theater, and I just want to walk you through a few of the ones that most surprised me when I was researching and writing this book. The first one is that the building that we all see and think of as Ford's Theater, in fact, was not built to serve as a theater. It was built in 1833 to serve as the home of the First Baptist Church in downtown Washington. And it was the First Baptist Church for 25 years, from 1834 until 1859. The church has an interesting history. Unlike many Baptist churches of that era, this was a mixed race church. There were whites, there were free blacks, and there were slaves, all part of the congregation of this church. It was a church that reached out to the middle and lower classes of Washington, D.C. They used the Bible to teach literacy. The minister of that church, a man named Obadiah Brown, has been called one of the most influential Baptists in American history. He became the head of this church in 1807. He arranged to buy the property for the church and to have it built, and indeed he contributed a lot of money to the construction of this building. He had an interesting career. In addition to leading this church, he was also the chaplain to the U.S. House of Representatives and to the United States Senate, and he had a high-level job in the U.S. Post Office. And in his spare time, he became one of the founders of what is today called the George Washington University and was chairman of its board of trustees. Perhaps the most interesting parishioner that I have found of the First Baptist Church was a man named Paul Jennings. Paul was a slave. He was born in 1799 into slavery. And as a slave, he was the personal servant to President James Madison when Madison was president. He was working in the White House in 1814 when the British came to town and burned down everything in sight. And he was one of a small crew of White House, I guess you could call them employees, who saved the famous Gilbert Stuart George Washington painting, which today, once again, hangs in the East Wing of the White House. He eventually bought his freedom, bought the freedom of his children, joined the First Baptist Church in the 1840s, and was part of the Underground Railroad movement. He then got a job in the pension office of the United States, and in 1865 he wrote a memoir of his time of service in the White House, which has been called the first White House memoir. So fascinating individual. The second vignette from the theater occurs after the assassination. I'm going to skip past the assassination because everybody knows about the assassination. And it's in here, but it's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about after the assassination. So April 14th, 1865, President Lincoln is shot. He's taken across the street to the Peterson house where he dies the next morning. Soldiers immediately take possession of the theater. It's a crime scene. They kick everybody out of the theater. They post soldiers at every entrance. Nobody can get in. John T. Ford, the owner of the theater, happened to be in Richmond that day. He ran a number of other theaters, and he had family around the Mid-Atlantic area, so he was gone. He ran the theater with his two brothers who were in town. Within a few days, he, like pretty much anybody else who had any connection to John Wilkes Booth or to the theater, had been arrested by Secretary of War Stanton. Remember, this was the first terrorist attack on the United States. The president had been killed. The Secretary of State had been almost killed. Nobody knew who was behind this, how far it went, whether there would be more such attacks. And so the Secretary of War, very, very powerful official, second only to President Lincoln, launched a massive manhunt for anybody and everybody who may potentially have had something to do with this crime. Many of the stagehands at Ford's Theater were arrested and incarcerated. And John T. Ford, although in fact he had nothing to do with any of this, spent over a month in jail in very bad conditions. The jail, called the Old Capitol Prison, sat where the U.S. Supreme Court sits today. He was eventually released in May, but still was not given control back of his theater until late June. You know, you can speculate that Secretary Stanton was not happy about the fact that his commander-in-chief was assassinated in this man's theater by an actor who had worked for John T. Ford, perhaps with the culpability of other employees of Ford's Theater. So he was in no hurry to give this theater back to John T. Ford. But eventually John T. Ford got the theater back in late June, and then the question arose, what do we do with this place? You know, you go to the theater today and you think of it as a high-class thing to do, right? You put on your suit, the Washington Post writes about it, it's a very sort of high-class thing to do. Well, back in the 1860s, there was great angst in this country over theater. Actors were immoral. People who went to the theater were immoral. It was a frivolous pursuit. You know, if you have free time, you should go to church. You shouldn't be hanging around the theater listening to songs. And so the fact that the President of the United States had been shot in a theater by an actor created great controversy at that point about what ought to be done with the theater. John T. Ford actually tried to sell the building. There were some who thought it should be turned into a religious building. Some thought that it should at that point turn into a Lincoln Museum. None of that happened, and so John T. Ford, being a businessman, trying to run a business, decided to reopen the theater on July 10th. He was not allowed to do it. He received an anonymous letter, which is reproduced in the book, in so many words threatening to burn the place down if he dared to desecrate that holy place by putting on a show. And that was not the only such threat. And so shortly before the performance was to begin, War Department soldiers again seized the building, locked it, and put him out of business. So what do you do with the building? Well, John T. Ford, you know, they stole his building. They stole his business. He threatened to file suit. Eventually, the government bought the building for $100,000, about $1.4 million today. And what did they decide to do with it? They decided to turn it into the most inconsequential, low visibility, low controversy thing you could do with a piece of government property. They turned it into an office building. So they ripped out the stage, ripped out the presidential box. Everything in there that suggested theater was taken out and replaced with 3 stories of government office space. The first 2 floors were occupied by the Office of Pensions, which in effect was the first Veterans Affairs office of the United States. All Civil War, Northern Civil War veteran pension applications went to this building or were processed by one of 500 clerks who worked there. In the 3rd floor of this building was the Army Medical Museum, which displayed a macabre collection of disfigured skeletons and skulls and body parts and photographs of dead people. It was really, in fact, it still exists over in Silver Spring. And the most interesting thing about it is displayed in that Army Medical Museum was part of the spine of John Wilkes Booth, located a mere feet away from where he performed his act. The last story I'll tell relates to the resurrection of Ford's Theater. So this place was an office building, and an office building it remained for 100 years after the assassination. Finally, as the 1960s approached, public and government views about what ought to be done with this place had changed. You know, the shock of the assassination was far in the past. Nobody from that era was alive anymore. We were approaching the centennial of the Civil War, so there was a historical interest again in the Civil War. John F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, which created public interest in the circumstances of presidential assassinations. And so a movement was created to restore the theater to what it had looked like in 1865. So that people could see, and there was great public demand for this, people could see what did the place look like when the assassination occurred? Where was Lincoln sitting? Where did Booth come from? How did he get out? How did this all play out? And so finally, the Congress appropriated $2 million to first perform a detailed study of what the place had looked like in the 1860s, which was no mean feat because there were no blueprints from the 1865 theater. They had to rely on photographs and newspaper articles and contemporaneous documents of the time. But between 1965 and 1967, the building was gutted for a second time. All of the office building stuff was taken out. The building was reinforced. The front and some of the back walls of the building are original to 1833, but everything inside was recreated in the mid-1960s to be, we hope, an exact replica of the 1865 theater, albeit with modern amenities. And so, come the end of 1967, that's what you had. The theater, at that point, was owned and operated by the National Park Service. The National Park Service proposed to do with that building what it does with, outdoor parks and other indoor historic sites. Assign a group of rangers to give talks about the assassination. They created what was then a high-tech sound and light show, narrating the circumstances of the assassination. And that was basically all they were going to do with the theater. But an exceptional woman named Frankie Hewitt stepped in. Frankie was originally from Oklahoma. She grew up in California. She had come to Washington, much as I did, as a young adult, and made her career here. She worked for Adlai Stevenson when he was ambassador to the UN. She had good connections with the Kennedy and then Johnson administrations. And her husband was Don Hewitt, who was the first producer of the 60 Minutes television show on CBS. So she had a foot in the Washington political world and in the entertainment world. She knew Stuart Udall, who was then the Secretary of the Interior, which of course the National Park Service is part of the Interior Department. So he had ultimate control over the Ford's Theater building. And when he told her that they were rebuilding the building and they were going to send rangers in to give ranger talks, Frankie was appalled. She said, you know, if that's all you do with this place, all you are doing is building a monument to John Wilkes Booth. And given Abraham Lincoln's love for the arts, he went to Ford's Theater 10 times during his presidency. Despite the controversy it created. I mean, you know, you see every time President Obama goes to play golf, what kind of guff he gets. Imagine what criticism President Lincoln took when in the middle of managing the war, he went to the theater. So Frankie said to Stuart Udall, given all of that, you have to allow live theater again at Ford's Theater. And Udall responded, quite understandably, the government should not be in the business of putting on plays, which is perfectly understandable. Can you imagine the criticism that would happen if the federal government was picking plays, hiring actors, and putting on performances with taxpayer dollars? And so a compromise was reached in which Frankie created a nonprofit organization called the Ford's Theater Society, signed a contract with the National Park Service that involved obtaining access to the historic property in exchange for producing and financing theatrical productions in the space. And it's 45 years later, and we're still doing it. And I think we're doing a better job of it than we ever have before. And today, 150 years almost after the assassination, yes, Ford's Theater is still known as the place where Lincoln was assassinated, but that's only the hook to bring everybody in. Because once we've got them looking at Ford's Theater, then we use Ford's Theater to teach people about who Lincoln was, what happened in the Civil War, and what his legacy is here and around the world. So let me finish by doing as all authors, accomplished, and me are supposed to do, and read a short excerpt from the book. More than 150 years after his election to the presidency, Abraham Lincoln remains an enigma. Born to illiterate parents, he received only 1 year of formal education and conducted himself with so much humility that he was dismissed as a rube by much of Washington society. Yet Lincoln is regarded as one of the United States' greatest presidents and is revered around the world. He understood deeply the moral and legal compromises that created the country, and he overcame great personal and political challenge to win the Civil War, preserve the Union, and end slavery. He wrote and spoke with timeless eloquence about the shared values of the American people and how they apply to issues of public policy that still affect citizens today. Yet amidst all of these challenges, Lincoln made time to quietly attend the theater. Lincoln understood that the arts offer people temporary escape from the daily pressures of their occupations and help them better understand the higher purposes of their vocations. It is for that reason that high-quality theatrical productions continue to be presented at Ford's Theater today. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to take your questions.
Okay, we've got two mics, one here and one here for people with questions.
Great. I'm glad you're doing it, because otherwise my 11-year-old son Mark would start asking questions, and we can't have that.
I'm interested in this public-private partnership between the Park Service and the Private Historical Society, because I'm down there a lot. I'm a tour guide down there. So, I mean,
terrific. Thank you.
In the city. So I've heard the ranger talk a million times,
Uh-huh.
et cetera. And so you kind of work around each other, right, in a way? Because I know, for example, some afternoons it's closed to the public because they're doing a rehearsal, et cetera. But the Park Service did the museum, right?
Well, it's a
And the
bit more
education
complicated
center, I
than
wanted to
that.
ask about the education. Or did the Theater Society do the education center?
We did.
And then I understand there's something being built yet more across the street.
No, but let me
Okay.
kind
I
of give
just
you an
want-
overview of how
okay.
it works. So, but you raise an interesting point. You know, you go to Yellowstone, that's a big place, and it's all owned by the National Park Service, and they can do pretty much whatever they want there, and they do. But Ford's Theater was built out of this awkwardness. They had this historic building that was a theater. It made sense to put theatrical productions in there, but the government shouldn't be running a theater. So how do you square that circle? Enter the nonprofit organization that does that, takes some of the heat off of the government. And it was one of the first examples of a private public partnership between the National Park Service and a private organization. And so basically the way it has worked for 45 years is obviously the Park Service owns the building. They put on their ranger talks during the day. They have various other programmings, and they can basically do whatever they want within the historic footprint of the park site, which is the Ford's Theater building proper, what was the Star Saloon building located next door, which is today Park Service offices, and then a small building to the north of the theater, which is dressing rooms, and then the Peterson House across the street where Lincoln died. So they control all of that, and they do their programming there. We have the right, by virtue of our contract, to put on shows there. So we have access to the space during the day for rehearsals, for setting up the sets, and of course doing the productions at night. The museum in the basement has gone back and forth. When it was first rebuilt in 1968, that was totally controlled by the Park Service. About 10 years ago, however, Ford's Theater Society undertook a $55 million capital campaign to renovate the theater yet again. It really needed help. It needed to be brought into the 21st century. And so the Ford's Theater Society funded and organized and put in the basement museum that is there today, which is terrific. We also obtained lobby property in a brand new office building built next to the theater, so that's the society's. And then we bought and renovated the 10-story Center for Education and Leadership, which is right next door to the Peterson House, and that's where we put on our educational programming. We have more museum space in there. We've got a gift shop, and that's where the Ford's Theater Society staff works. So it's a good good relationship. Yeah, you know, there are tensions from time to time. Last fall during the government shutdown, we had knockdown, drag-out fights with the National Park Service about whether we would be able to put on our shows in that space, and we weren't allowed to do it, and we took a big hit for that. So working with the government isn't always easy, but we're 45 years into it, and we're still around. Drew.
Hello.
Drew was an intern at Ford's Theater Society, and he did a lot of the legwork on this book, so you get to ask a question.
Thank you, Brian. I appreciate that. I was wondering if you could share with everyone else one of the biggest surprises that you found during the research, new stuff that you found that you included in the book and that you thought people should know about, a surprise of sorts.
I think the thing that surprised me the most was the antipathy in the 1800s towards the theater. You know, I was born in 1959. Theater is a classy thing to do. I'm very proud of the fact that I can on occasion go to a nice show. But, you know, the Continental Congress passed a law before the Revolution, passed a law saying any government office holder who goes to the theater is unqualified to serve in government because of his moral turpitude. You know, notwithstanding that, President Washington went to the theater, President Lincoln went to the theater, but it was you know, I say it's kind of like monster truck shows are today. I mean, it was where people went to drink, to carouse, fights broke out in the audiences. You know, the performing artists had moral scandals, if you can imagine that, in the 1800s, and so. And that animated, I think, a lot of the antipathy towards the theater after the assassination. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who were offended that what started out as a holy place was transformed into a den of sin, and who felt that that imposed a curse upon the building, which explains the assassination and some of the other terrible things that have happened in that place over time. So I think that's what surprised me the most. Gordon.
Well, that actually raises the question I had, which is there a story behind how this move transitioned from becoming a place of worship to a theater, and was the congregation very divided about that sale?
Yeah, and I was advised never to give away all the secrets in the book talk, because then people won't buy the book. But since you asked, yes. So what happened was, by 1859, the congregation of the First Baptist Church had merged with another church that already had space a few blocks away. The congregation had some serious debts that they needed to pay off, and so they put the building up for sale. Who's going to buy a 25-year-old church? Well, another church, maybe, but the building was 25 years old. It wasn't in that great a shape. And in fact, theater owners were a natural target clientele for old churches, because it's a pretty cheap building to convert into a theater. If you think about it, it's already got, a raised platform at one end. It's got a lot of seats. It's set up for, a few people up front to address a huge crowd in the back. And so it made all the sense in the world for John T. Ford, who was looking for an inexpensive way to bring his theatrical business to Washington, to set up shop. Some members of the congregation were against it, but they were also against being deep in debt too. And so in this instance, as in so many cases, money went out. Chuck.
A quick question that comes to me from a theater performance we went there. I think it's in their brochure that you've had to change the seat sizes for people for today.
Yeah.
So that's one of the changes. Like when you restored it, it's not the same in that regard.
That is correct. And Barbara's laughing. It doesn't have anything to do with obesity, actually. They are, but that's not it either. So when the theater was renovated in the mid-1960s, attention to historical detail was the driving force. They wanted to make it look as much as possible like the 1865 theater. And remember, the government did not intend to actually put on performances in this theater. In 1865, people sat on wooden chairs, loose wooden chairs that you'd set up for the performance. And then if there was a dance the next night, you kind of move the chairs and it becomes a dance hall. So that's what they put in the 1960s. Well, those seats, and I've been on them when I first came to town, and people are nodding, they were really uncomfortable. You sit on those things for 3 hours, and they are not comfortable. And so when we renovated the theater in the mid-2000s, we decided, we are creating a theater that, yes, respects historical accuracy, but is also trying to compete with a lot of really terrific theaters here in Washington where people can take their theatrical dollar. And so we found cushy, comfortable seats that sort of look kind of old-fashioned, and nobody's complained. Any other questions?
Okay, last question.
Okay. So Brian, what were any surprises you learned about Lincoln himself as you were doing your research?
I think it was the degree of disrespect in which he was held here in Washington. I wince at some of the things that are said about President Obama, and there's a side of me that's inclined to think, oh gosh, where is this country going? If we can't even treat our elected president with respect. But going back and reading books about Lincoln, people said far worse things about him. And even his cabinet didn't respect him. They thought he was a terrible war manager. They thought he was a terrible manager of the government in general. You know, he couldn't control his wife. He couldn't control his kids. And he brought some of that upon himself by, as I said in the little quote, conducting himself with great humility. I mean, here he was elected president of the United States, but he thought of himself as a kind of a simple country person, and he related to the average person, and that's what made him so charming. But in the 1860s, you know, presidents are supposed to carry themselves with a certain amount of dignity, and many felt that he did not. So I think, yeah, Lincoln was a human being, and he took it just as bad as our current president, if not worse.
Okay, thank you, Brian.
Thank you. Thank you.